All right, so I got a couple of diagrams here to help me explain some of this stuff. But I figured I'd talk about torque and horsepower and what that kind of means to you, and also how to attain it in your VW engine. You could use this for any engine. I use it in every engine build I've ever done. And I have all these things in consideration when I'm trying to build an engine. Even the simplest build, if it's anything modified over stock, then I'm always looking at these types of things. So I'm going to start with torque and horsepower. And the way you can always think about torque, and the best way to think about it is leverage, is let's say you're loosening a bolt and you have a really small lever like this one here, and it's really hard to loosen the bolt, and then you get a really big lever, a longer one, and it's a lot easier. Torque is kind of like that. Torque is basically developed in exactly that way. So if you think about torque is actually something that is more a manageable power than horsepower. So if you don't build any torque into your engine, you're going to have a car, like it's, as soon as you get to the horsepower range, which is more in the RPMs, it's going to be super powerful and squirrely and all over the place. It's going to be really hard to manage. So if you think about your torque as being a long wrench, then it's easier to understand that what you're trying to do is you're trying to get something that's a manageable horsepower, and sometimes that's more your friend for what you're building. In fact, you always want a great deal of torque in your build when you're trying to build something. So there's several ways to develop torque and horsepower, and we're going to talk about both of them. More torque, if you understand the same concept. So if you have a longer crankshaft, because it has basically more leverage between the center point and the rod, you have more torque. Okay, and another way to get more torque is have more inches. So if you have a bigger piston, it's going to push harder on that lever, the crankshaft, and it's going to develop more torque. The ideal torque is going to be the actual crankshaft length, but you can get torque by just going bigger, more inches. So more inches, more cubic centimeters, they develop more torque. That's just the bottom line. More crankshaft length develops more torque. So if you put that in Volkswagen terms, if you go with like a 67 or 69 millimeter crank, and then you go to a 78 or 82, you're going to get a lot more torque from going that 82 than you are even just going a larger piston. So, but you will get more horsepower when you have. So to develop more horsepower, if you have a larger piston and a shorter stroke, the top end will develop a better top end horsepower. So that's called over square and under square of your engine. So if you have a larger piston than your crankshaft distance, then you're going to have a lot of top end horsepower. If you're going to have a really long crankshaft and a really small piston, then you're going to create a lot more torque and less horsepower. So the whole thing is the game in racing, and what guys are always looking at is they're trying to figure out to get what they want out of their engine. So when they do a run and stuff like that, now they use computers and they're figuring out, okay, we need more torque because we need more manageable power when we first start off, or we need more RPM at the end, so we got to give up some of our torque somewhere. Usually that's what you have to do. You have to give up something to get something else, and it's a game. So that's kind of how you should be figuring out your engine build whenever you're building your engine. So other things that can contribute to more horsepower and torque are the valve sizes. So if you have a larger valve and the air is able to escape in the exhaust side faster, or you're able to get more air and fuel mixture in and it able to pop and give it more downforce, that can give you a little bit more torque, but more on the horsepower end. So when you're putting big valves in your engine, usually you're going to get their biggest benefits usually going to be more horsepower than torque. And that can be really your friend, because, let's put that in driving terms in your car. Your Volkswagen can be going down the road, and let's say you're at, like, say 2,800 RPMs, and you want to increase your velocity from going from 2,800 RPMs to 3,000 to pass someone on the freeway. So, or from 3,000 to 4,000 RPMs, depends on how you have your engine set up. You want a little bit more horsepower, and you could use some more torque to do so depending on the weight of the vehicle. So having big valves can give you that type of horsepower there when you need it, and that sort of thing can work out good for you for that. So let's say this is your carburetor. I know it's terrible. I just threw it on here just for fun. And the longer distance you have between your intake valve and your carburetor. So if you have a really, really long intake runner, is going to give you more torque. Now, these things, some people go, oh, well, that's not true, or whatever. It's absolutely true. This is done in racing all the time. So the longer the intake runner, the more torque you create. So that's why I kind of freak out when I go, guys, put dual carbs with really short intake runners on a bus. It's like, yeah, okay, well, you're going to get more top end, but your torque, which you're trying to increase, you're losing some torque by doing that. So the longer the intake runner, the more torque you have. The shorter the intake runner, the more top end you create. So those are things that you can also keep in figuring out your engine. This is why they have those, like on V8s, they say a torquer manifold. It's a little taller. That means because it has longer intake runners. And they have those big, long tunnel ram ones, because the straighter the intake runner, the more top end you get. So, when in a Volkswagen, you're always going to have rattlesnake, intake runners if you go really long. So you lose a little bit on the top end. So these are types of things you want to keep into consideration when you're trying to do your build and figure out what you're trying to do with your engine. Now, another thing that creates more torque is a higher compression ratio. So if you have a higher compression ratio, that will give you more standing torque, because it gives you more downforce on the piston, because the combustion pressure is higher. That pushes it down. Same thing with the turbocharger. When you have a higher pressure inside your combustion area, or even nitrous, stuff like that, gives you more combustion pressure. But there's also a double-edged sword with that, with detonation and with other things as well. So sometimes you have to manage that, figure out how much detonation you can take, if any. In fact, none in a VW is where you're at. So anyway, that's something else that you can take in consideration, is having a higher compression ratio, as long as the engine doesn't get too hot. Because what you do is you go higher compression ratio, you end up increasing your combustion temperature. And combustion temperature is your enemy when it comes to detonation. So you have to keep that managed just right. Now, the reason people go counterweighted crankshafts is because then you're taking the torque also, and you're managing it. So your torque isn't able to break things as easy. If you have a counterweighting or crankshaft for that firing time, then it actually helps your engine spin better and gives it more reliability and not break quite as easily. The thing with going too much on the torque side too, if you go too much on the torque side and you're using that torque, like you're punching it all the time and dropping the clutch and things like that, then your transmission is going to break very quickly. Then you have to go with a much bigger, much more money. You can spend as much money in your transmission as you do in your engine. So keep that in mind. If you're going to do any upgrades, especially anything to like a 2-liter, and you're going to be using any of that power, then you better have a transmission that backs that up. Now, when it comes to exhaust, it can really get complicated sometimes, and some of the new cars have really come out with some of these massive horsepower cars that are engineered today, because of computer systems and stuff like that. They've actually figured out a lot of this stuff down to you really need to be able to do this on a computer. There's no way. You have to have like formulas and timing and length. I mean, I don't know, you have to be really, really knowledgeable, but I'm going to kind of give you the basics. I'm not really that versed on it, but I'm going to give you the basics so you can understand how an exhaust system can either benefit you or hurt you. And it's a little bit of guesswork because I don't know if anybody who's really engineered a Volkswagen exhaust. There's the merge exhaust, which is really good because it's going to do something else, and I'm going to explain in another part of this. But here's the basics, okay? So whenever you have, and this is kind of, I don't know if it's exactly a vacuum, but there is pressure on this side. So when you have your combustion that's going through your exhaust, right? You have your combustion here, and you have your pressure on this side of the exhaust, and you have your vacuum on the other side of the exhaust. So just keep that in mind, that as your exhaust goes through, there's pulses going through that exhaust, and if you can time things just right, you can use this vacuum side or low pressure side to actually suck exhaust out of another tube. And this is what they've mastered in some of the new cars. They've got so it almost creates almost like a turbo effect. So your exhaust gases can release through your exhaust valve as it's open, and really quickly and easily, and that can give you a lot more horsepower for the bang on your buck. But figuring all this stuff out, they were just starting to figure this out in the 80s, and I remember guys at the circle track that you could hear their cars, just the way they sounded just was so much more like the newer cars are, because they had these exhaust systems that they had figured out how to actually use that vacuum and pressure and combustion, and have that combustion be productive to pull the other cylinders. So as it would go through the exhaust system, the next cylinder would be right behind it, and it would actually create a flow effect that gave it even more top end, and that affects your horsepower mostly. But some guys will go way too big on their exhaust, and there's a formula on this stuff, and I don't know it, but there's a formula of too big and too small. And a lot of times the car manufacturers have done this already, done their homework. So, sometimes their exhaust system is actually better than one you put on it. Because if you go too big, then what happens is you're trying to manage the velocity of the exhaust, okay? Get it to flow properly through the exhaust system. And if you go too big, it becomes turbulent in the exhaust. So your air kind of goes through there and does willy-nilly stuff, and it doesn't flow as good, so that you're not utilizing this vacuum. You're actually losing the vacuum side of it, because it's doing this turbulence through your exhaust. And if you're, so like on my Turbo Rabbit, I have a really big exhaust. So where I lose my horsepower is I lose a little bit in the bottom end, but it's a diesel, so it's got so much torque that it doesn't really matter. But when at the top end, this stops happening, and I increase my flow. So on a turbo car, a lot of times having a really big exhaust will be beneficial, especially for the top end horsepower. But you might have a problem with lower end horsepower because it's turbulent inside there. So I'm just kind of giving you some heads up on how to kind of figure that out on your own. Sometimes going too big on your exhaust actually will hurt you because of the turbulence. It's not necessarily because a larger exhaust has more torque or less torque. It's actually the turbulence is created, and the inability for the productiveness of the vacuum side of the exhaust to actually pull the exhaust through the car. Now, on a short, on these guys where they run these dragsters and stuff like that, they're not as worried about this. This is more of a drivability thing through the whole power range, because the first thing that they do is they take the engine up to optimum power range, and then that's where they keep it all the way down the track. So on a dragster where they have really short exhaust, but as a drivability thing, you're constantly trying to figure out this not to be too big, not be too small, where you lose all your horsepower, because it's not really back pressure, but you have you have more pressure and more velocity going through here, and sometimes that, like I said, if you don't have the proper formula figured out, you can do that. And And I'm going to show you real quick about the merge type exhaust, how they work. So somebody's done some homework on these, and I don't know exactly how much of it they did, but I remember when they came out with the merge exhaust for Volkswagen, that and those were like on the sidewinders and stuff like that, I think. But this type of a muffler system actually works really good, because what they do is, as the exhaust goes through, this one, when it goes through the Venturi, this is on the pressure side, and they have it timed so that this one's on the pressure side back here, and this side of it's on the vacuum. So between the two pressures, there's a vacuum, and it actually helps suck the next cylinder through the exhaust system. And that's how all of the new cars are actually created, all the exhaust systems on those. And that's why that they sound so wickedly, high pitched, and it's just actually flowing through the system better, because they're actually using the pressure and vacuum, and low pressure, high pressure, however you want to say it. And I say vacuum because it's easier to understand, but I don't know if it's actually a vacuum that's created. I think it's actually a low pressure, lower pressures than this is. So, but it actually helps suck the exhaust through, almost like a turbocharger does with the with the intake pushing pressure into it, utilizing that. So that's what I kind of get. I kind of don't understand why a lot of guys go, "Hey man, I'm just gonna build 1914 because it's easy. I go with, the pistons. I just get the 94s, and I slip them in my cylinders, because I go, only got to pay for one thing, And then I go, well, wait a minute, did you put a stoker crank in? Oh yeah, man, I put a stoker. I put a counterweighted crank in. Oh yeah, I put a counterweighted crank in. Well, I was like, dude, if you want counterweighted, why didn't you just go stroker? If you're going to go a little bit more, and then get off those 94s, because the 94s, they put your studs so close to your cases, unless you're going aluminum. To me, it's kind of counterproductive, because you lose strength. You're putting your case studs right next to your cylinder. In fact, some of them are, you can see the case saver, because it's all the way through. And to me, it's just like, you're kind of losing the ability. So I like to go with, like myself, I'll use the 90.5 is about the biggest one, or you can go a thin wall 92. Well, not thin wall 92, but they have a thick wall 92. And what you have to do is you have to take your barrels, and you have to machine those down on the top and bottom, or on the bottom at least, so they'll go into your cylinder block. So you have to. So basically, what you end up with is the same bore size in your cylinder block is you do with the 90.5, but you have a thicker wall on the part where the piston's moving up and down, and the top where it goes into the head, you'll have the same thick wall up there, and so you'll have the same size as a 94 drilled into your heads. So I don't know if you can understand what I'm saying. So that's about the biggest I'll go, is to 92. The 94s, unless you're going, like I said, you can do it. It depends on your money you want to spend. I think if you're going to go 94, you should go aluminum on your block. That's just my opinion. A lot of guys will talk against that, say, no, I done it all day long, man. It works fine. Hey, whatever. But if you're thinking about long term and want to drive it, for any period of time, it might be a good idea to consider that, at least. So anyway, that's a little bit about your engine, all the different types of things that you can think about. Oh, except for one thing I need to just go over, is camshafts. Camshafts can make all the difference in the world. All these formulas right here, all this different stuff about torque and horsepower can be totally changed by camshaft. And so if you have a bigger cam, bigger duration, bigger lift, you need to make sure that it works with what you're trying to do. So I like myself a short lift, or a high lift, short duration cam. And like I always say, Engel 110. I don't really like Engel cams, because I believe, if I remember right, they're like 300 lift and then 300 duration. I'm going to say that's just a square cam. I don't really like square cams. I like, say, mine's like a 268 lift, and like I think it's a a 340 duration or something like that. So I prefer short lift, high lift, 340 lift, 268 is the duration. Sorry, I got that backwards. So 340 lift, 268 duration. I like something like that myself because it's kind of a mid-range cam. Or if I go bigger, then I'll go for a higher lift and a little bit higher duration and that sort of thing, because it gives you more of a power curve where I like my power, which is, I like the power between 3 and 6,000 RPMs in there. And I don't like it all at the top end, which if you get too much duration, it kind of gives you more top end power. You get more horsepower out of it, but you don't get as much, torque. So you kind of lose the bottom end a little bit, but those types of things, you can figure out what you want to do by the camshaft. And that's another really complicated thing. I can't really get into all of the reasons why that is and how it works and all that, because it's too complicated, just like the exhaust. But I kind of give you a heads up that all that matters. So, that's where racing and stuff is all about, is the guys they're down to now, where they're just trying to figure out the formulas, just a little tiny change, and that little tiny change, makes all the difference in the world, when it comes to the end of the track and drivability and all that stuff. So, those are some of the things for food for thought. And if you utilize those things when you're building your engine, it kind of helps you figure out what you're doing. And you're not just like buying a bunch of parts and throwing them all in your car and going, oh, wow, I made it go fast. You're trying to figure out what you want to do. Because right now I'm trying to figure out, I might end up building a motor for the camper because the 16 single, and it's just not enough juice. And how much money, all these things here all depend on how much money you want to spend. So where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck? And how am I going to get, what I want to accomplish? And what I'm thinking about doing, and I'm just going to give you a quick heads up on what I might do, because I got a heavy camper. I don't want to build a transmission. I don't want to put a heavy duty transmission in it. So I'm not going to put all tons of carburation on it, because that'll bring my horsepower up too high. And with as much torque as I'll have built into it, I'll be breaking stuff. So I don't want to do that. So what I'm thinking about doing is I'm going to put in a cam somewhere in this range. I got some numbers I'll probably put up sometime pretty soon. We'll talk about cams, just one video, the ones that I like. And I'll probably put a cam somewhere in there. 260, 270 lift, maybe a little higher. I'm not sure, because I got to figure out which motor I want to go with. But I'll probably go with a counterweighted 76. Maybe I'll go 78. I don't know. Depends on how much work I want to do in the case. I could even go 74, but you got to go A pistons if you do that. 76, you got to go to B pistons. It's kind of where the line is drawn. And then, or you end up with a really, and with the 74, you end up with really tall shims on there, so it's kind of funky. And that can, there's a little bit of wobble. Nothing you can see, but there could be a little bit of wobble in there. And that vibration could cause, your heads to come loose more often. Those are the type of things you got to think about. And then too much reciprocating motion here creates wear on magnesium case. So, like I said, if I go any big motor, I would always go aluminum. I'm not going to mess it with a mag case, even though they're lighter, even though they're, I'm not trying to win races. I'm looking at, something be reliable and strong. So, if there's more reciprocating motion, then that's more wear on the case, the fatigue of the case. So I prefer, not going too large on my crank, but I might as well go counterweighted. If I'm going to go counterweighted, I might as well go strokers. That's why I look at it. Always, if you're going to go counterweighted, why not just go with the stroker and go with that? And then, so I'll probably do 90.5 by, 76 or 78, somewhere in there. which I think 78 is by 9.5 is 2007. That's a nice motor. And then I'm deciding I might put bigger valve heads in it. I'm not sure yet, but I definitely, if I don't, I will port them, because if you port them, that increases the velocity going in, which gives you more horsepower, more than torque, a little bit more torque. You can get out of it more, but more horsepower. And the reason I want a little more horsepower is because I want passing speed. When my RPMs are above like 2,800 RPMs, I want to be able to have a little bit of juice so I can, pass somebody if I need to. So that's what I'm trying to accomplish by having larger valves. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a 2-barrel. I'm going to have a Holly Weber 2-barrel, the old one, not the one from Empy. It's just not the same. I don't know. I haven't messed with them, but I've been told that they just don't work very good. But the old Holly Webers with the vacuum secondary, I really like those because you're always running on a really small carburetor, so you get decent gas mileage. And then when you do open it up, you have 60 CFM total, which is the same as Cadrons. I don't have to deal with dual carbs. I don't have short intake manifolds with the dual carbs Cadrons. I have really short intake manifold. That's not good for my torque, so I want the longer ones to run a 2-barrel. That's just my theory and why I do it. So I'll probably do that, and then I'll figure out a couple other things. I may end up going with the AA big valve heads because the spark plugs, around the spark plugs has more meat, stronger, and I would have big valves, and the big valves will help with that passing power. They won't give me any more torque really, but they'll give me more passing power. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about there. So those are the types of things I'm talking about. When you figure out what you want to do with your engine, you try and figure it out by using the methods that I do, which are, looking at all the different engineering ideas and figuring out what's working best for what you're trying to accomplish. And if you're trying to win a drag race, I'm not really the guy to ask about that. There's guys that are so far way beyond what I am in this, that do that they're, like I said, they're just changing just little tiny stuff, and they're doing one little tiny thing, then they do another little tiny thing, and another little tiny thing, and they're down to where they've got it all in their computers, and CB Performance stuff with those guys, and they have it all. Everything's all on a dyno. Daryl Vatone, some of those guys from Tectonics and all that. Everything's running a dyno. They got it all figured out. They spend a lot more time on this than I do. So, but this is just kind of basic knowledge for you guys that are trying to build your own, to figure it out and get your engine built and figure out what you want to do. I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.